Today's guest is Professor Michael Crawford. He is director of the Institute of Brain Chemistry and Human Nutrition. He's the founder, a trustee of the Mother and Child Foundation and the Little Foundation. He is the president of the McCarrison Society. He's the winner of numerous awards, which I will go into. He also helped me get the Food for the Brain Foundation started back in the 90s. Now, Michael, I met you first at the Royal Zoological Society in the late 1970s. What were you doing then? And to give us a bit of background, what was it that first got you interested in omega-3 fats and the brain?
Yeah, well, it was very simple. In East Africa, teaching at Makerere Medical School in Kampala, Uganda, between 1960 and 65. And during that time, I was impressed by what might be called nature's last effort in mammalian evolution that surrounded us in Uganda at the time. All this wonderful wildlife that people talk about. And the thought struck me that here we are, Homo sapiens, with this big brain, but why were there such different sizes of brains in the skulls of so many different species? So we set to the fact that most people were considering nutrition, and particularly malnutrition in East Africa at the time, to be a problem of protein. But the brain is made of fat. So we decided, when I got the job at the to head up biochemistry at the Nuffield Institute of Comparative Medicine, I had a brand new laboratory and with lots of nice, shiny new equipment. And the question was, what were we going to do? So the answer was very simple. Why shouldn't we try to answer the question as to what is the difference between why is it that there are such wide differences in brain size? And of course, the ultimate question is, why does Homo sapiens have such a big brain? Well, of course, he doesn't have such a big brain because the dolphin has an even bigger brain. But let's leave that for the time being. So we've effectively studied in total 42 different species and looked at the lipids of the brain and found that essentially the fatty acid composition, which we expected to be the variable, was hugely variable as expected in the liver. But when you went to the brain across these species, it was identical. This meant that the brain composition have been conserved powerfully throughout evolution. And so the difference between the species was not the chemistry of the brain, but the extent to which the brain had evolved, which meant, very simply, that the ingredients, the fatty acid ingredients of the brain were essential to the growth and development of the brain. And the two most important of those were, of course, arachidonic acid and docosahexaenoic acid. So that set us off on a trail for docosahexaenoic acid. So why docosahexaenoic acid? And the answer was very simple, that people accepted that omega-6 fatty acids were essential for mammalian reproduction. This was given, it was an accepted thing. However, nobody at the time thought that omega-3 was of any relevance whatsoever. So we had a big hill to climb, presenting evidence from experiments and human evidence, etc., etc. And a lot of other people became involved in it as well, to actually present the evidence that omega-3 were important to begin with, and secondly, specifically to present evidence that DHA was singularly important as far as the brain was concerned. That's really how it all happened.
And let's go right back. What is the origin of the brain, the nervous system? I mean, where was sort of DHA first involved, do you think?
Yeah, you were. Well, excuse me. Now, this is something that everybody knows, but they don't know. The brain evolved in the sea 500 to 600 million years ago. And it probably was started by the switch from the handling of photons from the sun, which for the first 2.5 billion years was used for photosynthesis by the algae and the light, as plants do today. So when oxygen became available, round about the time of the Vendian and Cambrian, beginning of the Cambrian period, when oxygen became available, oxidative metabolism became feasible, you had a whole different ball game, because during the first 3 billion years of life, there is no evidence of any intracellular detail. In other words, the cells were just blobs. And suddenly, with the appearance of oxygen in the scene and oxidative metabolism, what you now have is intracellular detail. Now, these are things like the nuclear envelope, for example. The nucleus with its DNA is neatly packed in a little package. The reticular endothelial system, the lines where protein synthesis takes place, the mitochondria, microsomes, and so on. And so effectively what one can conclude from that is that the advent of oxygen enabled lipid synthesis. Now, making fats requires more than twice as much energy to make proteins occur. And it would be particularly difficult to make something like docosahexaenoic acid in the first anaerobic phase of life on the planet. Because just to take the 6 double bonds of docosahexaenoic acid, it requires 6 oxygen atoms to make those 6 double bonds, never mind synthesizing the fat itself. So it would have been very difficult before the advent of oxygen to actually make something like docosahexaenoic. But once you've got oxygen, then you can do these interesting things. And so we now have a situation where we can make lipids, and lipids formed these intracellular details. They formed the membranes that wrapped up the nucleus, that wrapped up the mitochondria, and wrapped up the cell itself. And so effectively what we have is intracellular specialization. So it doesn't take a leap of the imagination to consider that, as we now know, that the cell membrane, the plasma membrane that goes around the cell itself, is highly specialized and for cell identification. So you have not just intracellular specialization, but you then have cell specialization. And then, of course, you had speciation. So this is an unsung story of the singular importance of lipids and lipid membrane structures in the advent of the 32 phyla, the different animal types that we have today. Now, the most important one, of course, was this photoreception business, because instead of turning photons from the sun into carbohydrates and proteins, it was now turning photons into electricity. And electricity sparked the evolution of the nervous system, which ultimately became the brain. And it happened with docosahexaenoic acid, with DHA, as being a fundamental structural component for these photoreceptors that did that trick. And the interesting thing, of course, is that the things like the dinoflagellates, you can imagine that whatever happened at 500, 600 million years ago, something like the dinoflagellates, which is an eye spot that can both photosynthesize and photoreceive and turn photons into electricity. Analyzing the dinoflagellate today, you find it is stuffed full of DHA, docosahexaenoic acid. Not only DHA, but also DHA in the phospholipids, which have got 2 positions, usually one with an unsaturated and one with a saturated. And in the dinoflagellate, we found John Sargent did it first from Stirling University, found di-DHA. That is, this photoreceptor story is that the photoreceptor itself is stuffed full of DHA. You really can't get any more DHA molecules in there. And so it was absolutely pivotal in the formation of the structures which converted photons into electricity and hence the origin of the brain. And we now find, of course, that it's in all the signaling systems of the brain, the synapses and neurons, and performs what we believe to be a quantum mechanical function in converting the signals from the brain into the things like thought, vision, hearing, touch, dreams. It's all happening through if you like, a sea of DHA.
Are these very sort of rudimentary cells that we're talking about, dinoflagellate, are they a little bit like eye cells? Because we know that the eyes are incredibly concentrated in DHA. And is this omega-3 fat DHA the sort of super clever molecule, semiconductor, so to speak, that can actually convert sun energy, photons, into nerve power? Is that kind of where it all started?
Yeah, that has to be where it started. And the dinoflagellate has got an eye spot, and that eye spot can convert photons into either carbohydrates and proteins as photosynthesis, and it can also do the photo reception into electricity as well. So it's rather a neat little thing. So we don't have evidence of exactly what happened 500 to 600 million years ago, but it's very likely that it was something like the dinoflagellate that started the ball game. I don't think it was the dinoflagellate itself, otherwise it wouldn't have got stuck as a dinoflagellate, but something similar and perhaps a bit more biologically versatile than the dinoflagellate would be doing this business of converting electricity into, photons into electricity.
So last month, moving forward, I interviewed Peter Rhys-Evans, author of The Waterside Ape, which gave me what I would say is incontrovertible proof that the development of Homo sapiens was a direct result. That the development of Homo sapiens was a direct consequence of becoming a semi-aquatic ape, living along the water's edge. Do you agree? What do you think was the role of marine foods in our brain development?
I don't think there is any doubt whatsoever that to achieve the brain size that we have in relation to the small body size, that we actually had to have access to the marine food web. This is a sine qua non. You can't build a brain without DHA, and there's very little of it on the land-based food web. And if you look at the size in relation to the body of basically all land-based mammals, you start off with a little thing like a mouse, a rat, or a squirrel, or a hyrax, or something of that size, small thing. They have got quite large brain to body weight ratios. And this is, I think, because they can make DHA from parent alpha-linolenic acid, which occurs in green food on the land. But as the velocity of body growth accelerated, so the ability to convert alpha-linolenic acid into DHA diminished. And you can see that we published the chemistry on this. The proportion of DHA in the liver lipids just simply vanishes as you get to these big animals. And with the vanishing of DHA, you get the contraction of brain size. So or on land, every species that evolved on land experienced a reduction in the proportion of brain to body size as it evolved a bigger body. And it's a logarithmic fall-off. That means that there was no way that Homo sapiens could have evolved just simply on the land. He would have had to have had, or we would have had to have had, access to a rich source of DHA, because we know that DHA is not just responsible for all this signaling in the brain. It also actually was shown by Laszlo Puskás in Szeged in Hungary and Andrew Sinclair, that the DHA actually triggers a number of genes in the brain to support its growth and function. So it's not just sitting there as a signaling system, it's also doing something very important, which is telling the genetic material of the brain, come on, let's build a big brain. So without DHA, there is no question in my mind, you just simply could not have had the evolution of the large brain. That means, without any doubt, that Homo sapiens had to have been evolving beside water. Let us put it this way, that he also had to have had land-based food, because the omega-6 are essential for reproduction, and we can't reproduce without it. And this is true, actually, even of the marine mammals, that they have to have, their limiting factor is not DHA, their limiting factor is actually the omega-6 arachidonic acid. And we have to have had both the best of both worlds, the best of the land and the best of the sea that enabled us to evolve this large brain.
And what is the difference between our brains and the brains of other animals, including primates, our nearest cousins?
None. There isn't any difference. Size is the only difference, extent to which they evolved.
And how much bigger are our brains than that of gorillas, chimpanzees, and so on?
Well, I can only answer this by just referring to the proportion of the brain in relation to the size of the body, because this is an important. People don't think about it. That actually, you're sitting there, but your brain is actually monitoring everything from your fingertips to your toes. It's monitoring every single square centimeter of your body. So the bigger the body size, the more energy the brain has to, the more function the brain has to devote to monitoring what's going on. And so the bigger you get, the less room, the less room you have for cognition. So what you have to do is to evolve a harmony of body growth and brain growth. And that's what Homo sapiens did by having access to both land and marine food systems. And I think it's quite important to realize that we don't actually have a big brain in relation to our body. A squirrel has about 2.3 or 2.4% of its body as brain. We've only got 2%. So we've actually got a slightly smaller brain in relation to our body than the squirrel. And in fact, this is quite a worrying thing, because the evidence is now that brain size has been diminishing. It's been diminishing since the cultivation of land-based foods. And we think that, at least I think, and I'm pretty sure about it, that the recent escalation of mental ill health is a consequence of the great success of the food industry in developing intensively produced land-based foods. And the marine food web has just been forgotten. And in fact, it reached its absolute maximum offtake at about the year 2000. And we're not getting anywhere near the amount of fish and seafood we should be getting.
I think I was reading that, our brains are approximately 3 times larger than that of the other apes, and that I saw one measure 10,000 years ago. I'm not quite sure how that was achieved, at 1.45 kilograms, so 1.5 kilograms. And then I remember reading not so long ago, 1.35 kilograms. So, I mean, do you think that our brain size has literally shrunk?
Yeah, I don't think this. Other people have published this, and I'll accept what they say, because Herto in Ethiopia, they have very good evidence of a brain size of 1,450 cubic centimeters. That was 160,000 years ago. And these were people that were living beside aquatic resources, both hunting and fishing, assumedly. So when you come down to the present day, where the brain size has been diminishing, and people have, Martela from Cambridge has reported on this, that the relative brain size has been diminishing since the time of the domestication of plants and animals. And we're down about the region of 1.35 cc's at the moment. So we've lost about the size of a tennis ball in terms of brain size. And I'm pretty sure that this is the imbalance that we now have between the access to the marine food web and freshwater food web as well. Don't forget that. That was also important. I mean, our lakes and rivers have been denuded of what was once a very rich source of food. It's just very sad, and it's just so logical that this is the consequence of this is an increase in mental ill health and reduction in IQ as well.
I remember when they found a 40,000-year-old Homo sapiens in the Gower Peninsula in Wales, and did sort of bone analysis, and concluded that about a quarter of their diet must have been marine food. And my logic is, I'm sure they were expending at least twice the calories. You know, life's hard. Yeah. You know, that therefore today probably half of what we eat would need to be for marine food to simply achieve what our ancestors have been achieving in terms of not just essential fats, but things like zinc and selenium and iodine and and choline and all the other essential marine nutrients.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that's really quite important to understand that. When I grew up, if we went out for a posh Sunday lunch or something, you always had 4 courses. You would have some kind of entree, which might be soup or something of that sort. And then you would have a fish course, and then you would have a meat course. That's quite interesting, because that was the thing to do when you were really going for a good meal. And actually, if we stop and think about it, that if you go back to Queen Elizabeth's time, about half the English income came from the cod, came from the fishing. Historical that we've had this connection. We're an island nation like Japan, and we made great use of the marine resources and the freshwater resources as well. It's just tragic. In 1950, the marine in Britain, the catch landing was about 1 million tons of fish and seafood. In 2017, I think it was about 330,000 tons. But in the meantime, the population of Britain had gone from somewhere in the region of 50 plus million up to 67 million. So the per capita landing has just declined rapidly. And it makes sense that we're now, self-inflicting this increase in mental ill health and decline in IQ.
Yes, so is that true? Is our intelligence, is our IQ actually declining? Are we heading for a race of morons? Somebody made that expression, didn't they? That we may be heading for an idiocracy. What do you think?
Yeah, that quote actually comes from, interesting, Graham Rose in the Sunday Times. In 1972, after discovering this with Andrew Sinclair, this relationship between arachidonic acid and DHA and the brain, and hence the significance of the marine food web and the significance of DHA and the significance of nutrition to brain growth and development. We published a book called What We Eat Today, and Graham Rose reviewed it in the Sunday Times on, I think it was the 5th of November, 1972. And what he said was that if these guys are right, then we're going to become a race of morons. So that's where the morons story comes from. Okay. And it wasn't our interpretation of it. We never said anything about race of morons, but it just shows that the message that we had in 1972 was straightforward and easily understood by somebody without a scientific background.
Now, you do research at the Chelsea and Westminster Hospital, which incidentally was the only intensive care unit that was giving vitamin C to its COVID patients and posted the lowest mortality rates. But how does your research impact on brain development of their patients and of their pregnant mothers?
Well, that is an interesting question, of course. If we go back to the evolution story just for a moment, the pregnant mother wandering around the seashore at that time, which would have been immensely rich in practically everything you can think of, from crabs, oysters, mussels, periwinkles, and so on and so forth, and fish trapped in the rocky pools and that sort of thing. She could have, even if she had children with her, she could have just wandered around the coastline and enjoyed the frutte del mare to her heart's content. And if the men had gone off hunting or something like that, if they didn't catch anything, well, so what? But if they caught something, then that would be fine. But it would have been absolutely available that she would have been able to complete her requirement for DHA and all these trace elements like iodine, selenium, zinc, copper, and manganese, which are also vitally important for the brain. And interestingly, you referred to evidence of coastal habitation and seafood utilization, but there is extremely good evidence of that going back to the first evidence of anatomically and behaviorally similar to modern humans in Pinnacle Point in South Africa, where they discovered caves that, with mountains of shellfish and absolute incontrovertible evidence of extensive exploitation of the marine food web at a time when Homo sapiens first appeared on the planet. So, and you've also got Chris Stringer's evidence of out of Africa that the planet was populated by people wandering around the coastlines, and that just absolutely so convincing, even if you don't know anything about the chemistry. So getting back to the mother and our work at Chelsea and Westminster Hospital, it all sort of started with work out in the East End and Wendidor study and Hackney study, in which we determined without any shadow of doubt that low birth weight had a major problem with regard to maternal nutrition right across the board. It wasn't just one thing. It wasn't just vitamin D. It wasn't just vitamin C. It wasn't just DHA. It was the whole nutrient quality of the food that was eaten by the people with the lowest birth weights was of the lowest order. And a randomized controlled trial provided convincing evidence that this was significant so far as the small for gestational age babies, which are at the highest risk for disorders of the brain. So that was in the East End of London. In Chelsea and Westminster, we then paid our attention very specifically to the essential fats. And what we discovered, two things. One was that we found that some of the fats that we were interested in actually, the status of the mother's cell membrane, the red cell membrane, which is a part of her tissue, so it's a part of her, so to speak, and an integration of what she's been eating, behavior, and everything else, her genomics, the lot. The cell membrane actually predicted preterm birth with a better than 90% confidence level when we studied it at first booking for pregnancy care. That's around about 12 weeks after conception. And we had the interesting thing about that, of course, is that the red cell membrane is what was the predictor, but the red cell itself has a half-life of 120 days. So what this means is that it's actually the condition of the mother, her health and nutrition in the months prior to conception that actually matters most. When you stop and think about it, the fertilized egg implants in the mother at about 7 days after conception. What is it implanting into? It's implanting into the milieu intérieur of the mother. That milieu is the consequence of things that have been happening in the period prior to conception, running up to the conception itself. That is the major importance to the successful conclusion of pregnancy right out to 9 months. So this was also confirmed when we looked at the magnetic resonance imaging of the brain. Part of the study was a randomized controlled trial of both omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids as a supplement. And what we saw was that the supplement, which was given early in pregnancy at first booking, was actually enhancing the development of the cortical gray matter, brain size, and the corpus callosum in the brains of the boys, but not the brains of the girls. And we know for a fact that it's long well established that the boys are so much more sensitive to essential fatty acid deficiency than the girls. So much so that in the early days, anyone working on essential fatty acid deficiency never studied the girls. They always just selected a whole bunch of boy rats to do the studies on. So it's interesting that the boys responded, and of course, this response would probably be more to do with connectivity in the boys than neurogenesis, because neurogenesis would start very early after conception, when the embryo got its act together and the brain started to appear out of the system. So that's really where we're at the moment. Two things. One is that the period prior to conception and around the time of conception is really the major determinant of pregnancy outcome. And the second one is that, yes, we can confirm that the influence of DHA in particular on the brain can be seen through enhancement of critical regions in the brains of the boys. If we'd started that study before conception, we might have seen a similar effect on the girls, and that's what we're going to do next.
And do you think that's why ADHD, for example, is much more prevalent in boys than girls? Autism also?
Say again?
ADHD, attention deficit, hyperactive disorder, and also autism is much more prevalent in boys than girls. Do you think this has something to do with it?
Yes, indeed. In fact, autism as well. And if you look at the COVID-19, the deaths are more prevalent in the boys than the girls. There's a major sex difference. Indeed, we reported this that in John Rivers and I, in a paper in Nature in 1974, showed that the impact of essential fatty acid deficiency operated before birth. It operated prenatally. And so it's no surprise that we saw quite striking difference between the response of the boys and the girls.
Now, if we lived in a world where before a woman became pregnant, she had to have a MOT, so to speak, what would you test for? If you could run a blood test and look at very specific factors, what is it that determines that a woman is much more likely to have a better pregnancy outcome and a healthier, happier, and more intelligent baby?
Yeah. The clincher was a fatty acid called oleic acid. It's a membrane component of the phospholipids that build.
That makes me think of olive oil.
Well, yeah, you can think of olive. It is the major component of olive oil, but it's got nothing to do with your intake of oleic acid. What happens is that oleic acid is monounsaturated. And Claudio Galli showed this in Milan many, many years ago, that if you were deficient of the long-chain polyenoic fatty acids like arachidonic acid and DHA, if you didn't have enough of this long-chain stuff, then oleic acid would increase in concentration in an attempt to replace the unsaturation in the membrane. So when arachidonic acid DHA goes down in the membrane, oleic acid goes up. And so this was a predictor not only of preterm birth, which it was at 34 weeks, it was also a predictor of the status of the membrane lipids that are going to be used for brain development. So it has two important significances. That it's, first of all, a predictor of preterm birth, and secondly, a predictor of the status for brain development.
Now, I would like to get a sense of what the brain is actually made out of. My understanding is that the membrane of our neurons are composed of these DHA, the very important omega-3 fat and arachidonic acid, bound to phospholipids like phosphatidylcholine. So, yes, what is the brain actually made of? What are the essential fats and phospholipids that we need to get in order to have the opportunity to build a healthy brain?
I'm not quite sure of the question.
It's really about what's the brain made out of. We've heard about DHA, arachidonic acid, but also phospholipids. What do we need to be eating to have the essential fatty components of our brain?
That's a very interesting question because we delve deep now. The neurons are the masters of the brain in the sense that they are connected to or developing from the neurons through the dendrites are something about 7,000 to 10,000 synaptic connections. And these are the things that connect up with everything else and transmit information, and we believe are actually the focus for cognition and consciousness. Now, the brain neurons and synapses are extremely rich in DHA. And we have shown this quite a long time ago. DHA is selectively incorporated into both the synapses, neurons, and even the subcellular components of the synapses. But to maintain all of that lot, you have to have the oligodendrocytes, the glial cells. And the glial cells actually outnumber the neurons. And whilst the synapses, photoreceptors, we think of the photoreceptor as a synapse with the outside world from the brain, the synapses and neurons are rich in DHA. The glial cells have got much more arachidonic acid. Well, this is interesting because they're actually the cells that do the job of maintaining the brain, of wrapping the myelin around the nerves and things of that nature, and providing the nourishment for the neurons and synapses. So the glial cells are actually terribly important, and the people seldom talk about them, but they're not as rich in DHA as the neurons and synapses and photoreceptors are. So you've got these two major components, if you like, in the brain, one of which is more arachidonic acid rich, and the other which is DHA rich.
And what about phospholipids?
Yeah, well, the membranes are made of phospholipids, and there are several different types of phospholipids, about 5 different types of phospholipids. Some of them are rich in DHA, and some of them are rich in arachidonic acid. It depends on which one you look at. The inositol phospholipids are rich in arachidonic acid. The serine phospholipids are rich in DHA. So you've got a whole bunch of different phospholipids that and different compositions which are required to maintain the what Meyer Bloom used to call the optimum physics of the membrane, to enable the proteins that are embedded in the membrane that do a lot of the work of the membrane, such as cell recognition, transport, signaling, adhesion, and so on and so forth. So the proteins are, of course, especially important, and their function is dependent on the surrounding sea of phosphoglycerides and the composition of those phosphoglycerides.
And I got very interested in the process of methylation and B vitamins, especially B12, but also B6 and folate. Folate from foliage, but B12 is only in the animal and fish, marine food type origin. And homocysteine, blood levels of homocysteine, which is an exquisite indicator of not doing methylation well, is also another predictor of pregnancy outcome and birth defects. So where does this fit in, the B vitamins?
Yes, you've got a lot of factors like that are responsible essentially for the expression of genetic information and the manipulation of the expression of genetic information. And it's another whole story that, but I don't particularly want to go into that. It opens up another chapter, if you like. But essentially, gene expression is driven by and hence the methylation of DHA is driven by the composition of the cell membrane, because these factors, arachidonic acid and DHA, both are involved with signaling to the nucleus.
And can we get enough of these nutrients today just from our food? If so, what should we be eating? And if not, what should we be supplementing our diet with?
No, I'm pretty sure that we are not, as a whole, population getting enough DHA. And that applies also to iodine, to selenium, zinc, copper, and manganese. And there's been some recent studies in young children, young girls, to show that iodine deficiency is returning to the UK, which is another signal of DHA deficiency, because they both occur at their richest in the same marine food web. So I think it's very worrying that we're seeing this kind of evidence emerging, which is just another bit of confirmation that the escalation of mental ill health is consequent on the food resource from the marine and freshwater sources.
So, I mean, how much should we be eating? And what if you're vegetarian or vegan? How do you then, can you get enough omega-3 if you just rely on flax or chia seeds?
Well, yeah, if you're a vegetarian or a vegan, then you should be eating marine algae. They'd be a very good source of kelp and things like that, sort of lava bread. All these things that we've more or less forgotten how to eat. The Japanese, of course, still use a lot of seaweed, and so do many other cultures, China as well. So there are sources that they can use which are not from the animal kingdom. But I wouldn't particularly advise veganism as a good thing for pregnancy, to be honest with you. I think if you look at the vegetarian cultures across the planet, they're the ones with the highest rates of iodine deficiency and also the highest rates of low birth weight and adverse outcomes of that nature. So that's another big story.
I actually got told off by the Vegan Society, very good nutritionist, for recommending that the algae would give, like lava bread, for example, would give enough B12, and that B12 really is devoid in the plant kingdom, and consequently they recommend that certainly any vegan should supplement it every day, and probably pregnant women as well.
I mean, you take I like getting my messages from nature rather than expert committees. And if you take a land-based vegetarian animal like a zebra, it has 350 grams of brain or thereabouts. In fact, probably less. You take a similar-sized marine mammal like a dolphin, it's got 1.7 kilograms of brain. I mean, you've got to think in evolutionary terms. It's not just what's going to happen to you today or tomorrow or to your baby or something like that. These things are the panorama of disease processes and of brain development and so on is multi-generational. It's not just something that's going to show up in the immediate present. And we've got to look at these things in nature to get your messages. And there's absolutely no doubt whatsoever that the arrival of Homo sapiens, and it was a big brain, was really consequent on the provision of the right kind of nourishment in order for this to happen.
And with a growing world population, 2/3 living in cities, polluted seas, and not enough fish, what is the future if we do nothing? What has to change for humanity if we're going to survive?
I don't really want to go there, but I think people can really imagine the consequences of declining IQ and declining and increase in mental ill health. It is these are the things which the brain is what makes us different from animals, and we'll just descend into an animal type of existence, which could bring with it a whole lot of behavioral disorders, violence, and antisocial behavior that would go with it. And one could see the end of humanity as being somewhat unpleasant.
Now, I've seen you've been awarded the highest award in Japan, the Order of the Rising Sun. What was that for? And how are the Japanese using your insights and research?
Well, in 1990, I was invited by the Japanese government, and they invited my wife as well, to do a tour of Japan, lecturing on the significance of the marine food web to human intelligence and health. And it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. I was looked after we were both looked after like royalty. And but at the end of the 2 weeks that we were there, I was in a room in the Ministry of Fisheries. And the minister sat at the end of one long table, and there was a whole bunch of people, professor this and doctor that, all sitting on both sides of the table, and I sat at the far end. And the minister asked me very simply to summarize what I'd been telling people in Japan, which I did. And as I did, I was a bit dismayed because it looked as though he was entirely uninterested in what was going on. And at the end of the discussion, he looked up and he said, "Thank you, Professor Crawford. You have explained to us why we have to agriculturalize the oceans, and this we will do." So I realized that he got the message fully. And now Japan has an excellent example of what this means. In an area in Yokohama, Dr. Takahiro Tanaka created a marine agricultural organization where just as we have grass pastures for sheep and cattle, he has grass pastures in the ocean for what was muddy beds for the mouth of an estuary for fish. And he has extended these grass pastures, marine grasses, quite extensively to help with the reproduction of the fish and for also to provide food for the vegetarian fish. Then he has developed, and this took him 15 years of research before he did anything, he has developed artificial reefs. Each of the 7 species that they were targeting, 7 fish species that we were targeting, have got artificial reefs designed specifically for their ecology and their behavioral patterns. So, for example, some fish like to hide in little holes in the rocks and things like that. So he has reefs with lots of little holes in them, and so on. And these have been planted in deeper waters. And so he's not just developing a grass pastoral system for the fish and seafood. He's also developing the enhancement of the basic marine productivity that starts with surfaces. You have to have a surface for stuff to grow on. And you can see this with any old wrecks that fall down to the bottom of the ocean, that they soon get colonized by all the beginnings of the marine food web. That's where it all starts. And what has happened, of course, is that since they have started this, they have tripled the productivity in terms of fish compared to what was happening before. And whilst they have increased productivity, fish catch in surrounding areas has been diminishing. So of course, he's not just stopped at the 7 target species of fish. He's also got oysters and mussel beds and all that kind of stuff. So you could imagine that we would really have a new industrial revolution by developing our coastline in this kind of way, as developing marine agriculture. Let's face it, Foresight Report 2011 said that we had reached the limit of land available for arable agriculture. Yet, and in 2000, the global fish catch reached a limit. And since then, we've added 2 billion to the population, and there's another billion on the way. The only way we're going to be able to feed these people is if we start developing what the minister said, agriculturalize the oceans. It's the only solution. 71% of the planet is covered in water. And we've got to start with cleaning up the estuaries, the rivers, lakes, start cleaning up the coastlines. And this was the message, interestingly enough, of the Declaration of Manila in 2012. And we've got to start doing this as a matter of urgency. And the beauty about it is that we not only provide food for the expanding population, we also solve the problem of mental ill health, which we have to solve. It's a more serious threat to the sustainability of humanity than global warming. But it will also solve global warming, because you can't grow any more rainforests, but you can grow them in the sea with kelp forests. And kelp forests do exactly the same as the forests in the Amazon. They fix CO2. They address ocean acidification. They address climate pollution by CO2. And they provide food. They provide fertilizers for land-based agriculture. And so it's a win-win situation all the way along. And it's not just kelp that fixes CO2. The whole system that Tanaka has developed in Japan is based on actually starting the marine food web with the photosynthetic stuff. And that photosynthetic stuff, which is the food for the fish and seafood, that photosynthetic stuff is taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and giving us a choice for the future. It's the only way that we're going to be able to feed future populations. And it's the only way we're going to save mental health of the children to be born.
Michael, you've taken us from the very origin of the nervous system and brain to the evolution of Homo sapiens, to the kind of rise and fall of our brain size and mental health. And you've also, most importantly, given a vision for a future which can restore us to our true and rightful state as Homo sapiens, happy and healthy. Now, I understand that you have recently finished a book, which hopefully will be out soon. What can you tell us about that so we can access your amazing world of information?
Yeah, well, David Marsh and I, a friend of mine, published a book back in beginning of the 1990s, The Driving Force. And that really basically was about the role of nutrition in evolution. It was also about Darwin and his concept that in every edition of his wonderful book, he explains that there are two forces in evolution. There's natural selection and conditions of existence. And of the two, he says, the conditions of existence is the most powerful. Now that was his occupation really after he had finished all these books. He was interested in what was it in the environment that influenced the ways the genome behaved. And he talked about things like pangenes, but he couldn't find anything, and that was it. But we now know that this is epigenetics, that the influence of the environment is actually changing the way the genes behave. And we can see this quite clearly. In 1900, the cardiovascular disease, death from heart disease, was relatively rare. By the 1960s, it was number one killer. Now we're seeing obesity, diabetes type 2, mental ill health. The changing panorama of health is not due to changing genome. It's due to the epigenetic factors that are working here. And unfortunately, Darwin's view on the environment was destroyed by a fellow called August Weismann, who performed an experiment, which is effectively an experiment in mutilation. He cut the tails off rodents, and when the rodents persisted in growing new tails, he declared triumphantly that the Darwin's conditions of existence had nothing to do with evolution. And of course, mutilation's got nothing to do with conditions of existence. Unfortunately, this dumping of Darwin's conditions of existence fell on receptive minds, because everybody thought that they were the leaders of the world, so to speak. And from that day on, we had what might be referred to as the gene-centered view of biology, and the environment took a back seat. Now we're seeing today just how much the environment is actually threatening our own existence. And so we thought it would be right to restore Darwin's original view that the conditions of existence was the most powerful force in evolution. So that was the book, and we talked about the brain, of course, and how important it was to get the nutrition of the brain right. So this new book is really an update of that whole story, and effectively about what we've just been talking about.
And what's it called, and when might we be able to buy one?
What's that?
What's the title? And do you know when it's coming out?
Yeah, the title of the book is The Brain Under Siege. And it really is putting the case that unless we do something pretty quickly, we're going to lose humanity.
Well, Michael, thank you immensely for really a lifetime of brilliant research and thinking clearly through what is in a way so obvious but so massively ignored. I was really moved and educated by your work back in the 80s when I founded the Institute for Optimum Nutrition. We now have thousands of nutritional therapists who are carrying out, your kind of message. So I just want you to know that there's a whole generation of smart people who are doing their best to bring this into our cultures. So I want to thank you immensely for giving your time to share your wisdom on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.